Okay.
Somebody say me?
Hi, how are you?
Hi. I thought somebody said my name.
Erin did. But
Hi.
I've got one of her perspectives over here, I think. So, um,
Yeah, I see. Okay.
okay. So, for those of you who are already here, I started recording. Thank you for joining me on this little weird first time adventure here. So bear with me as I kind of like work my way through any of the kinks. I think everyone should have kind of came in muted. If not, just mute as you go through. By all means, don't hesitate to ask any questions, but just for general kind of keeping everything together while we move our way forward. Hopefully you can see sort of four screens. There's me talking here. I have the one from above on the cutting board, a little side angle one here that just helps to kind of get a little bit more focus on the way I cut things and a little bit more close up to it. And then of course I've got the stove back here behind me just to be able to kind of get it since I don't have a live camera crew. Kind of jumping camera angles, it's all a little easier to just sort of, do everything at once. So if anything needs to kind of get gone back through again, please let me know. But in the end, we're just gonna try and make soup, and soup is meant to be, I don't know, sort of warm and comforting. It's a great sort of collection of techniques that allow you to use up random stuff in your refrigerator, get a little bit more longevity out of it, depending on what you do with the soup. You can take them and freeze them after the fact. And so you can kind of make a little bit bigger of a batch and then be able to go through and kind of take, next week's or, sort of stash up a couple of rounds of soups and like get a little bit ahead for some quick, easy meals. Depending again on kind of what's in there. Usually with freezing it, it's a little nicer if it's something that doesn't have a whole lot of chunks, just because the freezing things tends to make it a little bit mushy. So just things to think about as you're rolling along. But we're gonna get started. So the first thing is going to be, we're gonna get the stove going with just a little bit of heat. We're gonna probably put it right around like just below sort of the halfway point of your settings. And what we wanna do with that is we want the pan to sort of preheat before we add any oil to it. But this will give us an opportunity to start to kind of get our vegetables cut up as part of our base. And normally when we talk about sort of the base of any soup, we're referring to what the French call a mirepoix, which tends to be onion, carrot, and celery. And there are a couple of different sort of variations of this across the cultures. If you look at Creole cooking, they talk about the Trinity and also their sort of mirepoix, which has the addition of bell peppers to it. There you can add when you get into like Spanish cuisine, there's like onions and tomatoes, and I think it's also bell peppers and saffron. They call it like a sofrito, and that's sort of a base for soup. So you're going to see this sort of collection of really great aromatic ideas and sort of local produce as part of a sort of starting point for a lot of different sort of cuisines when we look at soups across the world. So for ours, we're going to go through and start off with some onion, celery, and carrot. My celery is a little long in the refrigerator, so it does have a little bit of extra color to it. So I apologize for that. But with your celery stalks, you want to make sure that you can kind of cut the base off of them. And make sure to run those bad boys underwater. They do grow in sort of a sandy, loose dirt soil. So they tend to get really dirty inside the ribs. So you want to make sure that you kind of get into this center section and make sure that you wash this part out, because it will end up with, kind of collecting a lot of dirt. And then, as you can hopefully kind of mildly imagine here, since I already had these ones cut up, if you kind of take your stalks, you see you've got that little bit of a sort of roundingness to it. If it's super big, like some of these other ones, you just want to try and split it in half. Some of these little smaller bits, I mean, it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your soup, and then how small you want your pieces to be. One thing I like to think of as far as soups go, as far as a good rule of thumb, is I want my pieces to fit on a spoon, right? Like imagine the idea that people are going to eat this. And so you want it to try and be as seamless of a process as possible, just to make sure that, nobody's trying to like half gnaw a carrot off of the end of a spoon because you made the bad boy, like dollars, dollar coin size. I always used to tell the culinary students and the kids at the restaurants, like, imagine you're sitting across the dinner table from your grandma. Like, would you want to watch her try to like figure out how to get this thing in her mouth? If the answer is no, then cut it down a little bit. Like, you just want it to be nice and easy and seamless. So with these celery pieces, I'm going to go through and I've got them all sort of sticked out a little bit ahead of time, so they're relatively similar in size. I'm then going to go through and kind of bunch them up. One thing I guess we can talk about with knives is position and hand holding. So I use just like kind of a standard French knife. It's got this nice sort of taper to it. It's got a good handle. For me, I tend to put my index finger sort of on this center part here. We call that the bolster. So I'm just a little bit past the bolster onto the blade. And then sometimes, depending on what I'm doing, I find myself kind of choking up on the knife. So that way my middle finger is pressed up against the bolster, and then that index finger is really pressed up against there. You can roll it back. For me, that's not comfortable because I like to have a little bit more, it feels a little bit more like I'm in control here with this. On the flip side, my thumb is definitely past the bolster, but this is what's kind of pinning between my forefinger and my thumb, is kind of like keeping the blade in place. And then when you look at the way I want everything to be, is that I want the knife to kind of give me a nice long straight line up my arm, so that way I have control over it. Since I am dealing with something that's sharp and could potentially damage me, I want to be in control of all the factors, where the knife is, how much sort of wiggle it's going to have across it as I go through my items. And then as we look at this style of knife in particular, it's designed for this kind of cutting. So what we're going to typically do is we're going to go through, we're going to take our tip and push that part down first, and then we're going to rock the knife forward and utilize that curve in the blade in order to get me a nice, smooth, straight cut. So that way I'm not trying to like chop it down where I run the risk of the knife kind of deciding it wants to dart sideways and give me all these like sort of weird oblong like door frame or door jamb style pieces. My other hand, just as important, because I don't want to lose any of these digits either, because we're going to go through and do what we call a dead spider, where I'm going to take my fingers, and opposed to having my fingertips splayed out, I'm going to take them and kind of try and curl them up a bit. So that way it kind of looks like a spider that's starting to sort of curl in on itself. So as you can see, I've got this little bit of an angle here up underneath my fingertips. So it's definitely tucked down and below. And so that when I take my knife, I can push it up against my first knuckle of my finger here, but will not have to worry at all about losing my fingertip. So with this, it's always kind of, using this claw method to keep my fingertips tucked back. Make sure I always know where my pinky is, because that one kind of tends to float out a little bit for people. And the last thing you want to do is leave a pinky tip in a soup. So that way I know where all my fingers are. I've got my thumb tucked down. And then when we apply this to the product, I'm going to go through and I'm going to take my fingers, and I've got my thumb pressed down onto it. I know where everything's at. I've got my fingertips curled, so I know where they are. And then I'm going to take my knife and kind of get started in the cut. And then you see I put the tip down, and then I'm just going to rock that piece forward. And then as I move my way through the product, I just keep sliding back my fingers with my little digits curled backwards, so that way I don't end up losing the fingertip. And you can start with as much or as little as you feel comfortable with. I want everyone to keep in mind, like, I have done this for a living for 20 years. I have probably cut a ton of every single type of vegetable that there is. So don't feel bad if you're not matching my speed. Don't feel bad if it doesn't seem like it's super smooth or comfortable at first, if it's something new for you. It's going to be about practice. It's going to be about repetition. But remember to keep yourself safe, keep those fingertips tucked back. So that way you don't end up having some sort of inadvertent jump into the hospital while you're trying to like go through and pick up some other new skill. So we're just going to go back through, finish cutting up these items. Once you get a little bit more comfortable with your cutting, as opposed to kind of starting at the top and rolling your way forward, with this knife, you can just sort of keep it on the board. And I just sort of push the product forward into this sort of knife chopping motion. So the knife itself isn't moving anywhere. I'm just rocking it back and forth, creating that space for the food to slide up underneath it, but it's just staying in one spot for me. So that way I know exactly what it is. It's lined up with my forearm, so that way I get a nice, straight, even cut. And then my pressure towards the back of it helps to get my pieces relatively similar to each other in size. We want to try and keep everything as close to the same size as possible because that's going to help it cook better, cook more evenly. And that way everything kind of cooks at the same rate. Sometimes we'll go through and we'll break away from that. If you're going to throw something like potatoes in here, they tend to get a little bit softer around the edges first, and they sort of round out. So those ones can be a little bit bigger than your other pieces because you don't want them to dissolve. But yeah, because you know that you're going to get some loss on the size of that part once it gets cooked and thrown into your soup. All right, so there's my celery. I've still got my pot heating back behind me. I haven't really done anything with it yet. We're just letting it kind of warm up. It's not so screaming hot that I'm seeing any smoke or anything off the edge. I'll occasionally like just put my hand over it, well away from being at the bottom of the pot. I don't want to touch the bottom of it because it's going to be hot. I just want to kind of get a feel for how much hot I've got going on right now. And it's just up here at the top, I can feel it warm. It's like kind of walking past a heater in a room. So it's nothing that's gonna like curl back my arm hair or makes me nervous about anything in particular. All right, so next we're gonna move over to the carrots. Carrots get a little bit weirder because you do have, typically have a fat end and a skinnier end. You have the skin that you need to deal with. If you're buying, farm fresh carrots, you're picking them out of your backyard garden, the skins end up being a little bit thinner, so you don't necessarily need to get rid of them. A lot of your nutrients for carrots are wrapped up right up underneath the skin. So if it's at all possible, it's usually a little bit better to leave the skin on, at least from a health standpoint. I know people have issues with it, so by all means, do what makes you feel the most comfortable. You can always peel it off. For me, I'm going to take this over the sink real quick, and I'm just going to give it a light brush with a little bit of cold water running up underneath it, and then we'll come back real quick and then get it cut up. All right. So I'm going through and kind of scrubbed any of those like extra hard spots that I could see. Leave most of the skin on there. It's just going to help. I think I don't mind the flavor. I've been eating carrots, raw, just slightly washed for a long time, so I'm very used to it. There is a little touch more bitterness to it sometimes. Again, depending on the type of carrot that you get, where you're getting it from, that kind of deal. So to get this started, I'm gonna cut off the end just because I don't want to have to deal with it for the moment. And I'm gonna cut off this little tip piece as well, just because it tends to be a little bit more, I don't know, sort of knobby and weird, and I just don't want to have to deal with it. So now I've got my carrot, but you can see that I've got, one end significantly larger than the other end. So I'm gonna try and find kind of like my middle spot between the two sizes and cut that away. So that way I'm gonna deal with these two things separately. Now, one way that we can go through and deal with this, if I want it to kind of match out and these pieces aren't, it's not too thick, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start by cutting it in half. And again, when I go through to cut, I wanna take my tip all the way down to the cutting board first. So that way the rest of the product is ready to go. It's kind of just waiting for me to finish that push through move. I've got my fingers on both sides. So I'm kind of giving it this nice sort of keyhole between my fingers and my thumb. And then as you can see, I've got my pinky way up like a flag, because this is one of those moments where it's easy to get it tucked up underneath your hand. And the next thing you know, you're pinching down on your pinky, and that's definitely not what we want to do. So pinky's up. I've got my 3 fingers on the product. I'm gonna go through and push through that cut. So that way I get a nice, good, even split. A good solid straight line. I'm gonna take that half. Then I'm gonna do the same thing again, because I'm just gonna cut this part of the carrot into quarters. So again, straight down, push through using the style and design of the knife, just to give me a nice, solid, clean cut. Again, so moving at my rate. For me, when I look at my cutting board, like this little spot is my sweet spot. Like this is where all of my action goes because of the way that I've got my feet positioned, the way that I've got my body positioned, how I like to hold my knife. So ideally, anytime anything starts to migrate around, Like if I'm over here doing this, I'm putting myself into danger. And then what I want to do is I want to make sure that like, because I'm trying to hold as much control as possible into these things, I just keep moving the product wherever I want to. If I need to like shift my feet and suddenly be on my left foot more than my right foot, it kind of takes my hip and turn it. And then my sort of master space is this way and kind of adjust to it. And I would take my product and adjust it as well in order to be able to make sure that, again, I'm not trying to, you know, fashion my knife hand and my regular hand to fit the product. The product's going to move to where I want it to be, so that way I can be as safe as I need to be to get this done. So like even for this, now if I gotta go through and put my hip up against the table here and kind of get this turnover, now my space is right here where I want to focus those cuts for. And again, same thing as the celery. I just kind of take it and bounce it out. Now that we've got a flat side, you can go through and take those flat sides, lay them out, so that way the stuff isn't going to roll on you as much. And then just work my way nice and slowly, smoothly through these cuts. I can go through and take a moment to kind of like get stuff out of my way. You can see I've got bits and pieces that are sort of sticking to the knife. If you get those, sometimes they're really useful. Let's see if we can get a better angle from here. To go through and see how they're all relatively even. If I wanted to, I can take and kind of base one cut right off of that next piece. So if I had one that was stuck on the knife blade, you know, like this one is, then what I do is I'll just take it and I line that up to my next cut and then just follow through. And then I've got more stuck on there, but I can still just use that as a guide. And so that way, as I go along, oops, all the ones that are there kind of end up at that same height. So it's a really good sort of nifty thing to think about. Oops, got a rogue. To go through and kind of get those cuts consistent as you rock along. All right, now this one's going to be a little different. First thing we're going to do, because this bad boy is a little bit larger than it needs to be for us to quarter it, is I'm going to go through and I'm going to have my fingers on two ends, so that when I'm pinning it together, I've got my top finger sort of tucked back again. So this is my guide for my knife. And we do have fire going on, apparently. Looks like it's something in the seam. I'm going to set that off on the side. We'll deal with that in a minute. Okay, so I take my fingers. I got to set off to the side of the knife here. I'm going to go through and I'm going to, again, have my knife along my finger here. I've got my two tips further back, so that way I don't have to worry about them. And what I want to do is I want to try and shave off a plank of this carrot about the same thickness as the cuts I've already got going on. And that's going to do us a couple of things. First and foremost, it gives me a beautiful flat surface to put the rest of this curve on. So that way I'm not chasing it around. I don't have to worry about it wobbling. I'm less likely to hurt myself as long as I've got these nice flat surfaces. For this one, I can go through, and now that it's about that thickness of those other pieces, I can just take it, cut that in half, and now I can add it to my pile of vegetables I've already cut. And now for this bad boy, now that I've got this flat surface, I'm going to basically repeat the process I did in the beginning and create a couple of planks. For this size, to keep it around the same shape that I want to for here, I'm going to end up with 3 planks. So I'm going to make 2 cuts. So I'm going to go through, and again, I've got my finger up on my top. I've got it sort of pinned with my thumb. I'm using this down force to kind of keep it stuck on the cutting board so that way it doesn't wiggle around too much. But again, my knife is up against my hands as my fingertips are tucked, so that way I know exactly where it is. I've got that nice straight line. I'm going to go down to the bottom of the board, push that cut all the way through, and now I've got that one plank. We can set off to the side. And then for this one, you can either try and cut it from here, and you will have a little less room, so depending on how you feel about your knife skills and your fingertips, or as usual, you can go through and adjust and move it so that way you've got that cut piece going away from you, so that way you've got a little bit more grip on what you want to go through and do. Because again, the product will move wherever you put it, and you want to be in control. So whichever way you feel more comfortable with. Sometimes when I'm moving fast, I'll do it this way. But the safer, easier bets, grab yourself a little bit more, sort of real estate by flipping it around, and then again, just kind of getting that solid finish off on the cut. If you mess it up a little bit, if it goes a little wonky, it doesn't matter. We're going to win anyway today because we'll have soup by the time that we're done. All right, so now with this plank, I'm going to go ahead and split it in half. Again, my goal is to try and keep as many of my pieces as possible at the same size. If I get a couple of like little rogue babies that are not quite there, or I get a little bit of discrepancy in it, you know what? This is handmade soup. It's the way it's going to be. Yeah. I don't know what else to tell you. Years and years of practice, tons and tons of time, spent cutting vegetables, and it's still just going to happen the way it happens. It's not the end of the world. If you're looking for like competition cuts and you want to try and do some super fancy stuff, like you get all next level and you're making French consomme and adding like brunoise vegetables as your garnish, like you have well surpassed me, and this is definitely not where where we should be talking about those kind of things, I think. So just want to get that cut up, get that rocking along. Okay, so I got my celery, I got my carrots. Next is the big bad onion. And so this bad boy, let's move that over here. So this bad boy, as you can see, is a monster. It's just about the size of my fist. So sometimes you're gonna have smaller onions. This was just the one that we ended up with in the grocery box this week. So I figured I got to start tackling this monster and getting it trimmed out. So I already trimmed off the top of it. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and trim off the bottom of it. I took a lot of the excess paper off of the outside just because it's a mess, and I didn't want to deal with it. So I just took it over the trash can and just kind of used my thumbs to sort of peel it back a little bit, knowing that I was going to cut it anyway. So I don't really need to spend a whole lot of time like hand peeling it just yet, because cutting it's going to make it a little easier to do that. So again, I'm gonna go through, I've got my fingers up here, my fingertips tucked back, I've got my knife going in, I'm gonna try and get down to my cutting board. And then if I need to, a couple of quick, sort of motions here to get it all the way through. For me, I, usually have a trash can right next to me. When I'm doing this kind of cooking. For this, I've kind of got like my little trash box up here off on the side of the cutting board, just to make it a little easier to kind of keep everything nice and clean as you're working your way along. And then I'll just take that part and dump it into the trash whenever I'm done. If you're really, trying to maximize the life of your vegetables and do all the rest of those things, you can kind of take some of these scraps and with a little bit of cleanup, add them to sort of your next batch of stock. If you're really trying to like minimize the amount of waste, if it's something you're really concerned about, you can try and like salvage that a little bit later. But that's not typically one of my concerns. And now, as you can see, I've got my onion. I've got this extra layer of paper here that now becomes a little easier to peel and get out of the way. Every onion is going to be unfortunately a little different, so no one size answer fits all. But there is a little bit of extra browning still here, so I still have some of that hard to eat inedible papering on this onion. Then I'm going to want to make sure that I take off this layer before I go through and cut it up. Because this is a beast and it's a little more onion than I'm going to need, I'm going to go ahead and cut it in half. And then now that I've got that half, I'm going to go through and just grab this little baby edge. And now I can get that last layer of sort of inedible onion paper and get that out of there. The same on this side. So now I've got myself a nice, beautiful half onion. I think that should be about enough for what we're going to do for the soup. So now that I got this onion that I'm going to go through and use, we get to the fun part of how onions are designed. I'm not sure it's a little whitewashed out, but I mean, most of you know, like onions have those nice sort of circles that roll their way around. So what we want to do is I want to kind of create pieces from this at an angle. So if we imagine this is our center point, I want to, as opposed to sort of the old school, like where I'm cutting straight down and sort of breaking up all these bits and getting lots of little baby pieces of onion. Instead, I want to take that focal point and kind of cut it at an angle. Now, depending on how fancy you want to get and how consistent you want your onion pieces, you can go through and sort of unpeel your onion a little bit, because you can adjust, like we did with the carrot, the way that we cut it to the size of the part that we're looking at. Typically for onions, it tends to be about 3 or so sections if you want to go through and kind of take this approach. But now as I go through and kind of cut into these angles here and then cut down across, I'm going to get a relatively consistent piece and size. And then this is sort of my next section. And then this will be the last section that we go through and deal with on it. If it doesn't really matter to you, you can go through and tackle the entire onion at once. And then go through and kind of get the same basic process. Because again, I'm not super concerned about if they're all 100% consistent to each other. We're just trying to make sure that we get them in there to get some flavor released out of it. So to start off, I'm gonna go through from here and I'm gonna come in at an angle. I'm gonna go back probably as far as I feel comfortable with, but usually I wanna try and get within that last sort of piece size of my onion with my knife tip. And I'm gonna come in at that angle, make sure that I touch the cutting board. My fingers are way up on top of the onion and out of the way. And then I'm just gonna lever it forward. So that way I get this nice sort of loose petal cut on the onion there. And then I might come back at it again, trying to keep that at that same sizing with my knife constantly angled toward my center point, and then just rotating my way around this onion. And then when I get to sort of past my halfway point, for me, I tend to just sort of kind of pinch it together. And again, keep my pinky way up out of the way. And then just continue to come in at that angle, trying as best as I can to get that finish of the cut to come into the center of the onion. So that way, oops, if I get some things that get a little loose, we can either tuck them back in or we can just slide them out of the way and we'll deal with them in a minute. Get to that last one. And again, make sure that you're kind of keeping your fingers out of the way, go nice and slow so you're careful. Get to that last part there. And so now that I've got everything sort of segmented, you can see the way that it's going to pedal up, and I'm just going to get nice little relatively uniform pieces of onion out of it. So put my fingers back up on the top, a little bit more like pinky and thumb, trying to hold it in as we go along, and the rest of my fingers, again, tips tucked. So that way I've got my knife up against the ridge of my knuckle, and then we're just going to come down and get these nice, beautiful little pieces of onion that are going to go into our soup. And then we just finish our way through as best we can. It's going to fall apart a little bit, depending on how you cut it. You can be super careful about it. If you get a piece that gets rogue and gets out of the way, just grab it, put it off to the side for now. We don't want anything weird that's going to go through and mess up with our cutting, because we'd much rather go a little slower on the onion than lose a fingertip and end up going to the hospital. So as those pieces come through, I'm starting to get back to where I was, where I left my cut. So now I'm going to go through and lay it on its flat side. And then same thing, so I'm going to go through with that angle cut and then just keep pushing it along as we go through. One little thing that might be hard to notice is that as I'm cutting right now, I'm kind of angling, like my knife is moving out of the way a little bit, as opposed to just going straight up and down and then coming back at it. I'm kind of going straight down and then swishing it to the side just a hair. This just helps me with some of these smaller items, just kind of constantly shoving them over into my pile and keeping them out of my way. Just a little extra sort of technique that you pick up eventually once you get tired of having things constantly in your way as you're cutting them up. You just sort of shove them off to the side as you go along. Okay, and then onions. So onions, years worth of cutting onions. They still drive me bananas, depending on how pungent they are, how fresh they are. You're going to get that sort of, the aroma is going to hit you, your eyes are going to water, things are going to get squirrely. If you can't see, stop. Flush your eyes out with cold water, wipe it down with a napkin. I know there's a ton of different sort of, housewife tales of, burning a candle, putting bread in your mouth. I know there's onion tearless goggles, all the different things that people do and sell in order to try and make a dollar, in theory, trying to make the world better in one way or another. But I haven't used a whole lot of them. I've pretty much just, gone through and keep it, just, kind of muscle through it. The amount of onions that we go through and cut regularly at the house don't really, unless I'm trying to make a French onion soup, don't really go through and give it that much of an issue. And then, again, depending on your, I guess, your severity of allergy to it. I mean, if it's something you absolutely can't do, I know that they say if you put them in the refrigerator, that goes through and kind of dampens them down. You put them in cold water. There's a couple other sort of things you can dig into that might help to kind of lessen the amount of sort of impact that you get with it. All right, so now I got my mirepoix after 30 minutes. So I'm gonna go back to my pot. And so I think what happened with my smoking air is that the sort of seal on the bottom was just dry heating, so it got a little smoky there. But we're gonna go through, and now, like I said, I'm gonna go through and have it kind of right at that just below medium space. I got a little bit of warmth in here yet, so I'm not gonna quite throw my stuff in there just yet because I want to give it a chance to warm back up, and then we'll throw some oil in there. We're gonna drink some beer. We can't soon, yeah. Do that. All right. While I'm waiting for that to warm up, just a minute. Talk about oil. I'm not sponsored by anybody, but exactly, crucial steps here. Not sponsored by anybody, but I do have a couple things that I tend to use. I used to make garlic oil pretty regularly. I would go through and like buy, a 5-pound bag worth of like pre-peeled garlic cloves from Costco, and then I would put it in a pot, cover it with oil. I didn't use olive oil just because it tends to get a little bit aromatic on its own. I use like Mediterranean blend or grapeseed oil, something super neutral. That then let me go through and kind of I put it on medium, let everything get there until it started to get nice and brown, and then I would let it cool to room temperature sitting in there. We'd strain out the garlic. I'd save the oil, and that became sort of my base. But now Costco sells one that I like. It's easier. It's got less mess for me. And then I was finding I was using the oil a lot faster than I was using the roasted garlic, so my ratio was really weird. So this helps me balance it back out again. So now that, there we go, got a little bit of heat on the stove here. I'm gonna take some oil. I'm just gonna give, I don't know, decent amount of coating on there. I don't want to flood the bottom and have it completely coated, but I do want to be able to easily get enough oil around everything. So now I'm gonna take my vegetables. I'm gonna throw these bad boys in here. Not sure if you can hear the sizzle out there, but the minute I threw these in here, there was a little bit of a sizzle. And that's really what I want to try and do is just right off the bat, I want to make sure that there's enough heat here that I've got some evaporation going on the vegetables. Because what we're doing is I'm not just sort of like starting off the cooking process. I'm starting a really complex sort of chemical reaction of caramelization. And so if I throw everything in cold, it will heat up and it will get there. But my first steps to that are going to create a lot of steam. It's going to release a lot of moisture. And it's not going to go through and it's going to take longer, really. It's what it's going to come down to. And I want to try and preserve some of my integrity of the vegetables for the simmer and the soup, but still get that same level of reaction. So I want it to be warm and get that sizzle right whenever we go into it. I got a rubber spatula just to kind of move everything around. I don't need to play with it all the time, but I want to make sure that I don't forget about it because it will potentially burn on the bottom. Your onions especially, after about 10, 15 minutes or so, start to become pretty susceptible to burning. So we want to try and make sure we're just kind of hearing it as it goes along. And I know it seems weird to like constantly listening to the food, but now that we're actually cooking with it, there will be noise changes depending on what's going on with it. Like right now, everything is really active. There's a lot of surface area. Everything has a lot of moisture coming out to it. It's all brand new, the hot oil, the fresh vegetables, and they're getting excited and they're meeting each other. And it's like a party, where they're like, oh, great. How are you? Who are you? Where do you work? What do you do? Like there's all this great conversation going on. In a little while, once they kind of get past that initial piece, as the sugars start to caramelize, they're going to create sort of a buffer against the oil because there's not anything really new going on there. It's kind of started to create those sugars. And it changes the sound and the level of the cooking. And so at that point, you need to go through and kind of like speed dating. You need to like get everybody to stand up and change seats so that way they start up the conversation again. And I apologize if it seems weird to anybody. I personify my food a lot. I'll eventually talk about flavor babies, which is something I've done for years. So just kind of understanding as well as I can the sort of relationship and processes that happen with food. Interesting. For those of you following along on the home game, let's see here. Hell on High, a Belgian style beer. And I think Aaron's giving it a, what was that? Yeah, I wouldn't rush out for it. There we go. All right, so now we're going to get on to the other parts of our vegetables. We're going to let this cook our way through. This is where it gets to be a little bit mix and match, depending on what you want to have in your soup. For us, what we have in the fridge right now is I've got some mushrooms, I've got some zucchini. The next door neighbor did one of those, 60 pounds for $10 vegetable things. So I ended up with a ton of fresh green beans that we're going to throw in here as well. Now, with these things, there's a couple of different options that we go through depending on what vegetables you have, what you want to add to it. It's going to sort of influence when it gets added. So like mushrooms, for me, I like them to have a little bit more of that caramelization and crunchiness to it, but I know that if I cut them too thin or I add them too early, they're going to get really mushy and weird. Same thing with my zucchinis. Like this isn't something I would necessarily saute, especially in a soup that I know I'm going to make dumplings in because it's going to have a longer simmer time. So I want to make sure that they're going to survive and have texture by the time I'm done, like building the soup, creating the flavor that I want. And those dumplings are all the way cooked. Green beans are about the same as the zucchini. If you use like parsnips, potatoes, sweet potatoes, things like that, that are a little bit more hearty, a little thicker, denser, you can add those a little earlier. You can add them into the saute if you want. But yeah, those will be your indicator on you have that one? Thank you. But those will be the indicator on when your soup is kind of done, because you don't want them to cook too far and get all sort of super mushy. All the things in the mirepoix are, a little bit heartier, or I'm trying to get the onions to sort of break down. I want those to be more of like a prevalent flavor profile as opposed to like something you actually like bite into and notice that it even exists. Speaking of our mirepoix, come back over to it, and again, I don't know how much you're hearing against it, but there's actually been a little bit of a decrease in the volume of the sizzling. I'm gonna let it go a little longer, see if I can't get it to be a little bit more pronounced. But now's the moment where like anything that's in contact with the bottom of the pan plus the oil is starting to caramelize. And the immediate moisture that's there is starting to already been evaporated off and cooked down. So that's where, we're kind of getting to them sort of knowing everything about each other. And pretty soon here, we're gonna have to go through and mix it back up again. So that way we can get some new life in this party here. So with my mushrooms, I'm just gonna go through, give these bad boys a quick rinse. Thinking again on what I'm trying to accomplish for the soup, it's gonna be relatively chunky. We're gonna have lots of chunks of vegetables floating in there. We're gonna have the dumplings floating in there. So I'm thinking with these mushrooms, with this size, what I'm gonna probably end up doing is go through and kind of like cut them in sixes. These ones that are super stemmy, I'm gonna cut off the stem. Again, just more about my desire for aesthetic. You can cut them however you want. Ideally, you just want it to be roughly the same size. So that way they're gonna be relatively convenient and cook at the same rate. With mushrooms, you do want to make sure that you rinse them. They're grown in, they're just grown in dirt with a lot of sort of extra fertilizer and things on them. So even if they look relatively clean, the amount of moisture that they're going to pick up in the rinse is going to be significantly less offensive than having like some sort of weird dirt clod kind of popping up in a bite of your food somewhere. All right, so I'll keep cleaning up our space here. Just make sure I've got my room to do what I need to. I kind of cordon off my workspace as much as I have. I am, very lucky to have a lot of workspace. I know not everybody has that. So depending on how you need to, if you need to put it in a side bowl, whatever, if you've got a much smaller sort of space there, do what you have. But ideally, the space that you're cutting in should be organized and clean, so that way you have less obstacles towards your cuts, and you're less likely to have any sort of injuries arise because of that. Oh, here we go. So now, like, I don't know if you can hear that same sizzle, but I'm about the same distance away, but it's really muted now. It's like very super low. So what we're gonna do, I'm gonna give it a good solid shake. And now I kind of like bring back a little bit more life to the party, a little bit more of that sizzle piece to it. It does seem like it's getting a little bit muted, but I don't see any solid color on my onions yet. See if we can, how well that looks. It's gonna be funky. That's just too bright. All right, so with the onions here, you can still see I've got a lot of solid white pieces in there. It's not quite as translucent as I want just yet. So we're gonna keep rolling with it as we go along. Yeah. You can definitely throw fresh garlic in there. I would probably hold off on adding the garlic too soon, because what'll happen is that garlic, especially whenever it's super small or added early, has a really high tendency to burn. But one thing I love to show people is that with garlic, especially if you have a knife like this, where there's a little bit thicker of a spine along the side of it, a really nifty trick for getting a lot of garlic sort of cut quickly is that you can go through and you take that fresh garlic, kind of, you got your clove of it here. There's all sorts of tools and doodads and rollers and things that supposedly help to make this a little easier. I honestly have not used a whole lot of them. I tend to just, if I'm gonna end up using garlic or fresh garlic, I tend to just get it pre-peeled because I'm kind of lazy at times about that kind of thing. But if you're growing your own, which I know is a great thing, kind of curing it, or if you can get your access to fresh garlic, having it around is always super useful. But with this fresh garlic clove, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take in my little sort of nubby piece here where the stem is. I'm going to lob that part off just because, not that there's anything wrong with it. If you want to, you can leave it on. I just don't like that little piece of woodiness. I feel like I always lose the lottery and I get that piece in my bite. I just have that kind of luck sometimes. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and I'm going to do the same thing at my fingertips back. And I'm going to take my knife and instead of cutting it on the blade side, I'm going to cut it on the spine side, which may seem really weird. And it does definitely change your grip. So be very careful. Make sure you're comfortable doing this a couple of different times before you like really kind of get buck wild with it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it over to the edge here so that way my fingers don't bump into the cutting board. And then I'm going to do that same piece where I've got my finger up against it so I know where my knife is, and then do that up and down rocking motion and kind of cutting my way through it one time. When I get to that end piece or when it starts to become a pain, I'll just take it and flip it on the flat side. So again, I'm just keeping my fingers nice and safe, and then just kind of keep working my way through. And then I'll take all of that mush and bring it back one more time. And I'm not sure how well you can see that, but basically I minced an entire clove of garlic with just 2 passes of my knife. I get really super small, super fine, easy to manage fresh garlic pieces instead of having to do what I was taught originally, which was like 85 passes of back and forth chopping with that fresh garlic and that knife, just causing a big fat mess. Really wearing you out by having to like kind of scoop it, like just trying to find the easiest way to go through with life impossible. So we're gonna go ahead and we'll add this fresh garlic to ours. So go to waste, but I'm gonna set it off on the side because again, I'm not quite there with my vegetables yet. And I don't want to add it too soon because I don't want it to burn. And we're gonna have that simmer time in there, so I'm not gonna be too worried about the garlic heat. So that way we can go through and get that nice sort of mellowed out garlic flavor. All right, so back to the mushrooms. I'm gonna take some of these bad boys with the big stems, just kind of go up against that bottom of the cap, separate off my stems. Anywhere that I feel is necessary. It doesn't have to be every one of them. You don't have to do it at all. That should probably be good. All right, so then my caps, again, everywhere that I'm cutting, I'm creating a space, right? Like I've got my little zone based on where my feet are, how I'm holding my knife, where my shoulders are sitting, how my body's oriented. So that way I don't have to worry too much about like my knife going rogue on me. I go through and I'm gonna kind of cut it in half. And now I can either lay the flat side down and kind of approach it the same way we did with the onion, where I kind of come in at an angle, knowing that I want sixes. So I go one there, and then I turn my onion, or pardon me, my mushroom, and then do my other one. So that way I get my 3 pieces. Or I can try and be fancy with it and come for the top. And again, just sort of keeping my fingers so I know exactly where they are in relation to the knife, and then just kind of get my cut. If I have one that's a little bit bigger or one that's a little bit smaller, I can always adjust, right? Like my goal is to get it to be about this size. So for this one, it's probably about half, probably quarter it. There we go. That way it kind of fits right in that nice little pocket. It's in that same kind of size range. With this bad boy here, it's going to be a little bit bigger. So we're going to go through, and I'm actually going to go ahead and cut this one in eighths. So I've got my quarters, but that's still just massive in comparison, right? That's not going to fit on a spoon very well. So then I'm going to come back through, and 2 different ways. Again, I would probably say this is your better way. Go through and lay it on the flat side, so that way it's nice and stable. You get your finger up on the top of it, and then you're just going to go through and kind of split it as best as you can down toward that sort of center split point. I won't even talk about the other way because bad habits are bad. Just like drugs. Drugs are bad, okay, kids? All right. So rocking our way through, sometimes you get that nice flat cap. I went through and split it in half. I feel confident that I can go through and kind of cut it that way for this one. I kind of bring this together for here, kind of cut it from there. And again, now I've got my sixes. Just, kind of playing around with different ways. I've spent a lot of time in kitchens picking up bad habits, so I apologize ahead of time. So I just kind of default into them as opposed to like having it be 100%. But you just kind of, we do what we do. All right, so then I got my stems here. I'm gonna go through and clean this up. Get rid of that piece. I go through and flip that. This has a little bit of extra dirt still left on it even after my wash. Well, and you don't necessarily have to buy the oil. You can go through and get it or make it, like I said, with that garlic and the rest of it. And that gives you, roasted garlic to play with. For those of you who don't tend to cook very often, or, trying to cook things that are fast and don't want to make a mess every time, like this is a lifesaver. I think Erin's always happy to go through and talk about how much she loves the idea of having this around because she just cracks it out of the fridge, throws like 1 or 2 cloves into anything, right? It's already cooked, it's ready to go. It's just adding a sweet, beautiful flavor to it. So I almost always like this to be in somebody's pantry as like a go-to for garlic because it's just so much less mess and hassle than the other parts. All right, so back to the vegetables. Our party noises have changed. It's definitely a lot more muted than it was before. We are starting to get some caramelization on here, which is good because that's what I was looking for in this particular soup. And you see now all my bits and pieces, the onions getting nice and translucent. We've got some caramelization coming around my carrots on those onion pieces. Nothing's black, nothing's too dark. I don't have anything really sticking to the bottom of the pan, which is good. So now we're gonna do one extra thing. So tomato.
It was sticking to the pan. What does that mean?
So if it's sticking to the pan, we probably left it sit a little too long. It's not the end of the world because once we add our liquid, we'll be able to release that from the bottom and get that flavor back into the broth. It's just something that like now runs a greater risk of burning. So we just want to try and keep an eyeball on that. In case it does start to happen, we can come back from it, but it just means that we're a little bit further along than we thought we were beforehand. So we just want to keep a tighter eye on it. So we mentioned about tomato and tomato product. One thing I forgot to type up in the posts earlier is I'm a big fan of tomato paste and having some sort of like concentrated, easy to access tube style tomato paste. I don't really care whether it's Cento brand or somebody else. If you want to find organic, whatever. The intent is that it's in a tube. It's easy to use. I can keep it in my fridge. So that way I can use a half a teaspoon, a quarter teaspoon of it at a time. And I don't have to worry about opening up one of those like 6-ounce cans and having to figure out like how to make an Italian family size batch of tomato sauce out of it. Just something I can get a quick hit out of. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to take and add that to my soup. It's going to be however much you think you like. You don't like tomatoes, you don't like the acidity, by all means, leave it out. It's not necessary, but if you do like it or you don't mind it, it adds a really rich kind of complexity to the base of the sauce. You'll know it as soon as you throw it in to your pan, like the aroma of everything just changes. And because this is already concentrated, I don't have to worry about getting any moisture out of it, right? Like it's already there. And so this just adds one extra really great layer of that kind of caramelized flavor that we're looking for into this soup. So once I add my tomato paste, I'm going to, again, the French term is pincer. We're going to pincer the tomatoes in there. I forget exactly what it means, but I know that that's what it is. Once I got that pincer in there, I've got a lot of extra sugar in here, so I run a much greater risk of getting those brown bits on the bottom. So I got to try and keep a little bit more tight eye on it. I throw in my fresh garlic now, because now I want to take the edge off of that garlic, but I've got my eyes on it. This is my baby now. I'm going to have my hands here. I'm going to keep stirring it. As you can see here, I started to get some of that browning on the bottom. Not a big deal. We're just going to go through, keep working our way around with it. Just making sure that that it doesn't get too dark, right? Like it can be a little bit there. It's only going to add to the flavor of the soup. When I'm stirring things, I tend to go around with my utensil, but I also shake and go around with my other hand. So that way my vessel and my utensil are both working. So I get a lot more action. It's not always the most controlled. I'm sure Aaron will be happy to say how often I am a messy as hell cook. But I like to have that little bit more sort of action rolling through this, getting things kind of hustled around, getting a good mix on it with, in theory, the fewest number of strokes, right? Because I'm trying to do other things. I'm multitasking as I'm doing this. I don't have time to spend kind of just like focusing on this in slow, easier measurements. Now we're going to add our broth, whether you made it or you buy it. This will be, kind of you picking the amount of soup that you want. So everything's going to be relative to the amount of vegetables you have. And again, I'm looking for that sizzle, right? I want this to be hot enough that I get that sort of that sizzling noise. And as soon as I get just enough liquid in there to kind of get everything moving on the bottom, I'm going to come in with my utensil. And it's going to be really hard for me to show you, but I kind of focus on those spots where I had the brown on the bottom of my pan. And now they're clean. And so what that did was that action of, hot broth or cool broth on a hot surface and that bubbling helped to release all of that. And now it's floating in my liquid, which is going to be great for the overall process and flavor of the soup.
The question was how much paste?
I think I put in about a half a tablespoon. So it's going to depend on what you like, but usually enough to, like, when I coated and started to stir the vegetables, I could see a light tinge of red across everything. Not like super deep, not the whole tube, but just usually never more than a tablespoon, I think, even when I'm making a really big batch of soup. We just want a little bit, unless you're making tomato soup, and then of course this adds more complexity to a tomato soup. So start small. You can always add more, but it's really hard to take it out. So you can kind of adjust from there.
Can you tell us what the French term for the caramelly bits is?
So on the bottom of the pan, they refer to it as the fond, F-O-N-D. I don't know if there's another word for it whenever it's like mixed into the mixture. But the fond is what kind of develops on the bottom. And then as we go through and throw the broth in there, we are deglazing the bottom of the pan and allowing the fond to release and drop into the liquid itself. Perfect. And then depending on the soup that you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish with it, like if you want like a hearty, like, sort of deep warming stew, you can deglaze with red wine. You can deglaze with a little bit of vinegar. you can pretty much deglaze with any liquid that you want in order to go through and help kind of build body into it. When we do a French onion soup, that's part of what we do is we'll take and caramelize the hell out of those onions and build up a whole lot of fond on the bottom, and then basically spin an entire bottle of red wine into it. Let all that release and then reduce its way back down. So we get rid of the alcohol, but we have all of those ridiculous extra flavor compounds in there. So it's a really great technique for pretty much everything that we can do within this pot. All right, so now that I've got all my fond released, I'm going to go through and just add back in the rest of the liquid that I want. We are going to get some reduction in here so we can overshoot a little bit as we go through and kind of like play with the thickness and how much we have. I know I'm going to add more vegetables. So I'm actually, for this amount so far, I'm going to throw in about 2 quarts worth of stock. A quart is 32 fluid ounces. It tends to be what I see the most often sort of like package size for pre-cooked broth. Ends up being like a 32 ounce, 32 ounce sort of aseptic container. But if you're making this stuff at home, in theory, you've got other sort of measuring devices and tools, between cups and or containers. It'll go through and kind of tell you what you're looking for volume wise. But in the end, I want to have, probably, if we looked at the vegetables in the bottom of the pan and said that the vegetables covered about the bottom sort of like 1/4 to 1/2 an inch, I'm now about 4.5 inches deep in the pan. So that way I've got some room for these vegetables to kind of simmer through. We are going to go through and do the soup dumplings in here later. So with that, I want a little bit of extra room for those bad boys to kind of float around and cook free form without having to worry about them sticking on the bottom. So having a little bit of that extra depth in there of liquid is going to be good for us. So now that we've gotten to that step, I'm going to go through and finish off with my mushrooms. And we're going to let that come up to temperature. It's still on that like just under half way on the heat. So that way I can get it up to what I want heat wise, because we threw in all that room temperature liquid. So there is going to be a little bit of decline. So now we're just waiting for it to ramp its way back up. So far, we haven't salted and peppered anything yet because we're waiting for us to kind of like let these vegetable flavors kind of come through and get pronounced. My stock isn't, well, the stock is low sodium. If you make your stock at home, I wouldn't season your stock because you're never sure 100% what you're going to do with it. And if you've got that extra reduction, you don't want it to become too salty in order for it to get to where you want it to be. So it's nice to keep it light and neutral, knowing that once we get a little bit closer to the finished product, we'll be adding our salt, pepper, and kind of adjusting those things as we go along. All right, so the mushrooms are there. We're gonna go through and let those bad boys sit off on the side. Not quite ready to add them yet. I'm gonna take my zucchinis, give me the next one I'm gonna get ready. And in my mind, adding these to the soup, they're both gonna go in at the same time. So I'm gonna go through and kind of put them in the same spot on my cutting board. The green beans, I'll probably wait for a little bit later. So I'll kind of have the zucchini and the mushrooms sort of pushed into one pile over here. I'll probably put my green beans over here. And then we're just going to wait until the broth kind of gets to what I want it to be. And at that stage in the game, we're going to go through and kind of add those in. And then we'll start working our dumpling prep as that sort of finishes these guys cooking off. The dumplings should take about 15 to 20 minutes in the simmering broth. So I'm trying to mentally time when these go in versus when I put the dumplings in versus how long it's going to cook. I'm imagining that these probably need about 30 minutes, 35 minutes or so to be able to get it cooked correctly. And there's tons of stuff on the internet to be able to kind of like help dial in those timings for it. For me, it's a lot about feel. Sometimes I miss the mark, but I think practice, repetition, tasting often, kind of keeping an eye on like what you had done when you got there. It's not needed. You can go through and do whatever you want into the vegetables. It's just whatever I had in the fridge as far as what we needed or what's going into this one. Lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, but then so that timing is just sort of, becomes something that you're constantly working your way through, understanding that texture piece. For me, the process of cooking is a lot of all the senses. You know, like I was talking about listening to it earlier, just something that I picked up over the years of constantly, you know, being in it and doing it, you know, every day, or you know, a couple times a day. In the restaurant industry, you know, I had a lot of times to pretty much do it a couple hundred times a day. But you know, again, just repetition, thinking about those pieces, knowing that there's some extra element of it, and that everything kind of works in concert together will help make it make more sense. You need this? Okay, so with the zucchini, I'm going to go through and wash it off, rinse it off real fast. Just cold water. I'm kind of, you know, let's see here. I got my fingers around the zucchini. I'm sort of twisting it and then going up and down. You know, sort of just kind of using this to make sure that I don't have any debris on the skin as the water's running through, just to kind of get any blemishes off there. If there's anything sort of stuck that I don't see, I can get that off of there. If there's any soft spots in there even, usually I'll find them there. So that way I know I can either cut them out, or if I got to take a look at it a little bit further, and sort of see if the, you know, how bad the bruise is on that piece of fruit or vegetable. With this on the cut, I'm going to go through and lop off the bottom. I'm going to lop off the top. We'll get rid of those. And then contemplating what I want to do with this. So if I want these pieces to be about the same size as my mushroom pieces, it's going to be really unwieldy to try and cut straight lines across the entire length of the zucchini. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bad boy and I'm going to go ahead and split it, because I'm the one in control here, right? I can do whatever I want with this in order to make sure that I'm safe, that I get the pieces that I want as close as possible. So now that I've got it cut in half, we're going to do similar to the carrot, where I'm going to kind of, you know, pin my sides. I'm going to look for that thickness that I want on my first plank, imagining I'm going to end up cutting this into, again, 3 planks. So 2 cuts, where we're going to grab this bad boy and go straight down. So I've got that one side. I apologize for that other plank piece. I would leave it sort of rolling here. This is definitely a dumb kitchen move, so I apologize. I'll roll that one back, because you can see already, like, this is just, it's a little wet and slippery here, and then the whole thing is rocking, like it's just dangerous. So we're going to take it and again, flip it on the flat side. Now we're going to come back at it. And now I'm going to get 3 more planks out of it. So I'm just going to cut it 2 more times. So that way I have 4 pieces against this flat side. Zucchini have a tendency to weep a little bit. I forget what the actual name is, pardon me, for the liquid that comes out of it, but it's not just like straight water, right? Like there's, if you've ever kind of played with them, it's a little sticky, a little slimy. So it's similar to like okra. I forget what it's called, you know, technically, but you know, it does definitely make it a lot trickier to work with, especially if you're doing lots of it. So just make sure that you're very conscientious about how your hands are, that you've got a good grip on it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. There's like this little beading around that zucchini there. That stuff it's not straight water. It's almost like it gets a little gooey. So just beware of that, because it can definitely lead you on an unsure fingering of, or holding, pardon me, an unsure holding of your zucchini. So we're gonna do the same thing to this one that we do that one.
We have 2 questions. Are canned acceptable?
Or what?
Canned beans?
Oh yeah, absolutely. With canned beans, they tend to get really super starchy in the water. So I would almost always kind of pull them out of the can and then rinse them in cold water in a colander, just to get rid of some of that extra starch. But by all means, I make chili with just straight canned beans whenever we make it at home, but I'd rinse everything all off.
Second question, do you generally keep the skin on, or is peeling it okay?
For zucchini, I generally leave it on. One of the things when you look at zucchini and like also squash, is you're looking kind of at the seed bed, as it has here, and then kind of like how that runs its way across the vegetable. And so this part doesn't have as much structure, so it tends to break down a lot. So when I cut my zucchini, I tend to try and keep some piece of the skin on there, so that way I've got a decent amount of the meat that's going to leave it having some kind of texture, If I skin it, I feel like they tend to dissolve and break down a little bit more. That might just be my, something in my brain, and not necessarily a real deal. But I don't ever really think about going through and peeling them off. The skin's thin enough that I've never had any issues with it. And then I think that bit of color also floating through there. I mean, the aesthetic side, like we had some yellow squash in here against, sort of the reds, the browns, the greens that are in this soup as it stands. We're already going to get some of the mushroom and the white. We'll have those dumplings, which will be like little yellow floaties. So just kind of getting a little bit of a kaleidoscope of great colors in there also helps the soup to feel more approachable and almost like not trick yourself, but make you think that it's going to taste better because of all the excitement you've got for the different pieces in there.
Last question was, should I put my tomato, peppercorns, or bay leaf in yet?
Bay leaf. Yes, throw the bay leaf in. The peppercorns would have been for the stock, I believe. We're not going to throw peppercorns in here. We're probably going to use cracked pepper, just because we don't want to catch one of those peppercorns in a spoonful. But yes, I completely forgot about it, and I also don't have any bay leaf, so I can't demonstrate it. But we would throw bay leaf in here now. Ideally, you want it to have like one big piece for this side, for this sort of sides of soup, and you want to kind of keep tabs of it as you go along. They tend to be nice and tough, even whenever they're brought back into kind of cooking the soup and simmering for a long time. But at some point, we're going to want to find that bad boy and pull it before we start serving the soup, because it's not like it's going to kill anybody, but it definitely kind of like interrupts the enjoyment for me, at least when I'm eating a bowl of soup and I've got this big fat bay leaf that kind of hits my mouth or kind of float in the bowl. I got to try to figure out somewhere I need to put it or what to do with it. But yeah, bay leaf should definitely go in now. All right, so back to the zucchini. Now that I've got my flat side, I'm going to go through and cut out those planks. I'm going to deal with my one flat sides first. So we're just going to go through, split these bad boys in half, tie them together.
The other one on there was tomato.
Oh, sorry. Fresh tomato we want to hold off on for a little bit, just in case, or just because they're going to break down and they're going to get a little bit lost at this stage in the game. I think we'll probably hold those until we throw in the dumplings, because that last sort of 15-20 minutes should be there. Tomatoes tend to need a whole lot of time to cook, and the acidity in there will be light and fresh and vibrant toward the end. All right, so the zucchini, I've got my pieces pulled together. We're just going to go through and cut. And again, I've got some of those hanger-ons for my knife blade. So as I kind of bring them forward, I just line up that next cut as best I can from that bird's eye view. And then I can get a relatively consistent thickness on those bad boys. For the planks, you see I got a couple of different sizes and shapes. Well, I guess I got two. We've got the one big sort of fat flank, and then we've got the two little side pieces. But again, trying to capitalize on the flat surface that we created and go through and then just kind of cut them in half. Toward this taper end, I probably could have skipped the cut in half and just kind of like cut it this way along and gotten closer to it. But yeah, it's not an exact science. So we're just gonna roll with it, throw it in there, and just lop these bad boys up. Now this piece here, we talked about the seedbed, and that's pretty much all this is, just straight seedbed, right? Like no side meat. So there's every potential that we're not going to see these bad boys by the time we're done with it, but that's okay. It's just going to add to the body of the soup for me. So I'm not too worried about it. But at least these other parts and pieces I have will have a little bit of that color, and I know that they'll have that texture there. So I know that I've got the zucchini in the soup. All right, now with the soup itself, we can see that I've got a little bit of action here in the middle. I'm starting to see that sort of rolling boil as it goes through. There's a little bit of bubbling along these sort of outside edges. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it down to about in between like my lowest setting and my medium setting, because I want to slow it down just a little bit. And I want to just almost see just baby light bubbles floating around the outside edges, as opposed to seeing that big rolling boil kind of coming off of the middle of the heat. We're gonna let that sort of cycle its way down, but just let those veggies go through. And as I'm stirring it, I can feel when the carrots hit my spatula, like those little hard bits. So I've got a pretty good idea that they're not quite tender anyway. I'm gonna try and fish one up real fast. Be careful, that's hot. I've got, not dead hands, but tough hands. So if you, use a spoon and do the things. Oh, parsnips, super good. I'm gonna try my carrot here. It is actually pretty close to tender. I can kind of stick a thumbnail in there, but it definitely doesn't just mush out. Like it takes a little bit of effort. I can't just, like easily smush it into nothingness, but it does have some give to it. So I know that we're getting close where I want to be with it. So with that, actually what we're gonna do is before I start cutting up the green beans, I'm gonna go ahead and add in the mushrooms and the zucchini. Now that they're cut, those carrots are getting a little bit closer to where I want it to be. I want to add this in so that way they have time to cook. And the thing about these kind of vegetables, the zucchini and the mushrooms, is that they've got a pretty decent amount of water in them. And so as we heat it, it's going to release that moisture. It shouldn't be enough to go through and kind of like give you an extra quart's worth of soup outside of like the volume of the vegetables. But knowing that these vegetables are going to go through and kind of have some of their own natural moisture in there, I want to give them some time to go through and kind of process of osmosis, expel their water and soak in some of the broth and that all those flavors there. And so now that we're at this stage and I've got those vegetables in, now is when I'm going to throw my first sort of round of salt in. And I've got kosher salt. I've got it in a little salt cellar thing I keep next to the stove. But just a nice, sort of grain salt. I use this because I can get a good feel for it. A lot of recipes and chefs talk about like a pinch of salt, which for me ends up being about a little more than a quarter teaspoon, almost a half teaspoon, depending on how aggressive I want to get with it. But it's because I can grab that texture as opposed to using like a table salt where it's all super fine. And you run a greater risk of over salting things too quickly.
So what do you do if you're using the table salt?
So with table salt, what I would do is I would, instead of shaking it directly into the soup, I would go through and kind of pour it into your hand. Typically, this will make sure that if I see any clumps or if I've got like a fast flowing thing, I don't have to worry about it kind of like ruining the soup and I can have control over it. And I tend to do like a pinky size sort of chunk or a puddle, pardon me, in the palm of my hand. And then I would go over to my soup and then kind of like shake it off into it, give it a little bit of stir and taste it. But working in those small increments, the table salt will still work. You just have to be a little bit more careful about it. But if you use table salt all the time, you should be a little bit more familiar to it. Just those people who kind of jump back and forth, there's a definite sort of difference in potency per square inch of table salt versus kosher salt. So it's a little bit of an adjustment period to make sure that you go through. And you definitely shouldn't use as much table salt by volume as you do kosher salt, just because of the big fat flakes and the sort of sodium concentration here. So I'm going to start off with, 2 nice big pinches worth of salt in there. And then we're going to give it a little stir. Because we haven't seasoned this yet, we've got all the broth in here, we've got the oil, we've got all these vegetables, the tomato sauce. Like, we should probably have a good number of more saltings that we'll need to do with this before we really start to notice it or run the risk of going over. We just want to try and make sure that we take it in turns as opposed to trying to season it all at once. Because especially with, like pepper and some of these other seasonings, if they get a little chance to cook, it changes the nature of the flavor. Like black pepper is super, bright and aggressive, like right at the beginning of putting something in there. But if you apply some heat and moisture to it and let it roll, then it kind of mellows out a little bit and gets a little bit better of a little bit more approachable of a flavor to it. So I'm gonna grab my spoon. We're gonna give it a little taste here, just to see like just how my broth is doing. Remember to be careful because it's gonna be hot. Whenever I taste things, I've gotten into sort of like the beer, wine, people's sort of tasting process. I almost slurp it a little bit because I want to bring in oxygen. When you think about the way human beings taste, we have 6 descriptors for flavors, right? But there's almost 14 million different smells. And so the way that this kind of plays like a combination lock, right? Like you have your first layer of your 5 or 6 different things, but then you have all these other infinite sort of pieces that come behind it that you want to go through and do. And so by bringing air into your mouth at the same time as you're letting things hit your tongue will help to draw better associations between the 6 and the 14 million, so that way you can hopefully start to pick out different pieces that you really like, and or know those things that you don't, or what you want to try and cultivate and make more prevalent or prominent in your food. Got it. Oh, thank you. All right. So this one, transitioning beers, for those of you following along at home. So now we have espresso oak aged Yeti from 2015. So going big. Oh, beautiful. Oh yeah, that's good. Always gets a little dicey with those coffee beers after they sit for a little while. Sometimes they have a tendency to get a little bell peppery. So it's nice to see whenever they last a little bit. Okay, so for my soup, I'm gonna go ahead and add one more sort of good pinch of salt at this stage. I'm gonna take some black pepper. I have a cracker, so that way I can take those fresh peppercorns and kind of grind it out. I do have it on its finest setting. I'm gonna go through and give it, I don't know, 15, 20 turns, something like that. Just enough to give me a good sort of sprinkling over the top. And then we're gonna stir these in. If you have a pre-ground pepper, by all means, feel free to use it. There's nothing wrong with those. One thing you want to be aware of though with that is like any of those sort of dried spices that, yes, they have a long shelf life, but there will be fall off on the potency of the flavor on some of them. Some get better, some hold steady. Pepper is one of those ones that I found that tends to kind of fall off after a little bit. And the thing that always resonated with me in the restaurants with those kind of spices and working with companies that do these sorts of things is like, you don't only have to worry about like how long has it been in your house, but also how long was it at the warehouse? How long was it at the grocery store? How long was it sort of in the processing period? So there's sort of a backstory before you even, kind of get to know your pepper or bring it home, that may or may not kind of impact that piece to it. So having the one container that grandma has handed down is great for nostalgia, but probably not the best for your flavor profile. It might be worth kind of getting a fresh run of it. I tend to buy smaller containers of it if I do pre-ground pepper, so that way I don't have too long of a shelf life on it. But just trying to make sure that those dried spices get a good rotation every now and again isn't the bad thing. One thing I do with that pre-ground pepper is I make sort of a quick sort of salt pepper mix. I'll have a little jar of it. It's done by weight. So I take my kosher salt plus a pre-ground black pepper that I got as a sample from one of the restaurants. And I do, is it currently, I've been playing around with it, so it's jumped around a little bit. I float anywhere between like 5-to-1 to 8-to-1 of salt to pepper, and then just mix it. And I do this by weight. Maybe another, if we keep this class thing going, another class will talk about the benefits and beauty of weighing things as opposed to using measuring cups. But just, it gives me a nice consistent, product every time. So I'll go through and kind of fill this up and, put 8 ounces worth of salt in it, and then just 1 ounce worth of pepper. kind of mix everything all up. And then this becomes like what sits next to the stove, because anytime, as opposed to having to grab two different things or constantly stick my hands in the salt and then dirty hands on the black peppercorns or whatever, I could just go through and get my one pinch out of here and get both that salt and pepper flavor to it. All right, so these mushrooms are cooking down nicely. You can see that they're kind of reduced in size. They kind of concentrated a little bit and shrunk down now that they've been in heat. The zucchini looking good. Definitely got a nice amount of bounce to it still. So everything's just sort of simmering along nicely there. We're gonna go through and grab, for me, green beans, just because like I said, that was the other random cool thing I ended up with. So I'd already trimmed them down, gave them a quick rinse last night when I got them. I'll give them one more quick rinse. What my volume is here. And then with these, I don't need to do a whole lot to them once I've trimmed them off. I trim the tops and the bottoms. There are green beans have that like little curly Q point on the bottom that's completely edible. I think I just got so used to it with the sort of aesthetic of the restaurants. I just always trim both sides. But those little, we call them pigtails. Those little pigtails of the green beans, you could go through and leave them on there with no big effort or worry and concern. So I'm gonna give these a little rinse. I kind of run them underneath the water, and then I've got them sort of bunched up in my hand, and I kind of roll them back and forth a little bit. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get them to create a little friction amongst themselves to be able to make sure that anything that's sort of stuck on there gets a chance to get out. As opposed to just kind of running with water, sometimes you're going to come across something that's a little stubborn on release. And so just giving it that little bit of a rub kind of helps make sure that you don't have any like little weird, dirt spots, or if there was a spot that had a little bit of like leaf rot on it or something like that, anything that's going to go through and kind of get in your soup or your dish and cause you a, sort of a moment's worth of like, what the hell was that? Okay, so in keeping with the I want it on a spoon idea, I'm gonna end up cutting these into little bits. I don't need to go through and cut them super tiny, but like a little over an inch, give or take, just because that's gonna be nice on the spoon. Sometimes these pieces, they'll be a little out of whack or just a little longer than we want. So I got the decision is whether or not I wanna cut them or if I wanna leave them. They are gonna get a little bit more soft as they cook. So, a little long for me is not going to be that big of a deal. But if it's something that you worry about, by all means, go through and get it adjusted out. Some of these bigger ones, if they're like super weird shape, I just kind of cut them individually. For me, this is my sort of I got my knife hand and then my like free hand. So everything for me is kind of like pile it here, cut it, and then sort of shove it over. Or if you're looking at like economy of motion things, it would be better if I was over here because I could take my free hand, slide it over, and then use the knife to kind of push everything that way. And that way, as the knife is moving, I'm already using my free hand to grab the next piece. Not sure, how many of you are concerned about the economy of motion in the kitchen, but things to sort of put in your subconscious and let that grow, just in case one day you're like, oh, that makes total sense. With cooking overall, I find that a lot of people get, I don't know, if disheartened is the right word, but they're taken unaware by just how much sort of repetitive work can go into a thing. I was talking to somebody about dumplings, like actually making, raviolis. We were talking about making raviolis and just, the sheer amount of work that goes into it. 'Cause you have to imagine like the size of them, and then how many does one person eat on a plate, right? Like if you have to go through and make it with the base and then put the filling and then put the top and then you got to seal it, you can't crimp it, you got to move it, you got to put it, you got to cook it. And that's one. And then an average person, depending on the size of the ravioli, is going to eat between like 3 and 10, so like, you want to feed 4 people. suddenly that's a lot of raviolis. And if it takes you a minute per, that's an hour of just rolling something that's basically going to be swallowed up in a bite. So sometimes that economy of motion and trying to make it so that way it's as fast as possible or as painless as possible really helps to go through and kind of, I guess, make it a little bit more approachable or understandable. All right, so the soup is rocking. Those are simmering along. My green beans on, they're not quite ready to go in yet. So what we're gonna do, now is we're going to get that dumpling batter going. So I'm going to jostle the camera and grab a bowl. I apologize that my bowls are all very kitchen-esque. That's just how I roll. But whatever bowl will work, we're going to go through and take about 1.5 cups of flour. I know I just talked about the benefits of weighing versus measuring volume stuff, but I don't have this recipe measured out. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick it up and then add it to our list of knowledge as we go along. Okay, so I've got my digital scale. I like to work in grams because I do. I got my bowl on here. I've got my cup of flour. I guess I'll talk about the whole weight versus volume thing now anyway. So if we talk about, how many of you know the idea of like taking a half or saying that you need 1/2 cup of flour is a really kind of a loaded gun because is it fully packed? Is it lightly packed? Is it sifted? Is it not sifted? And so when they go through and they talk about studies on volume, especially for some of this light ingredient stuff, you're going to almost always end up with some sort of variance. It's not going to be the same. And sometimes it can be pretty significant, like it could be 10 to 15% worth of difference in the weight of a volume of this kind of ingredient. So when you can get to it, more often than not, weight might seem a little bit more intimidating, but in the end, it's just going to make you more consistent. And kind of understanding what you're trying to do so your recipes will come out the same way every time. So this is 1/2 cup. I lightly tapped it and then I leveled it off. And so it gives me 80 grams worth of flour. I'm going to tear that off. What I'm shooting for in this recipe right now is 1.5 cups, just as I've hopped up on my soapbox here. Now this one, I'm going to go through and I'm going to try and pack it in a little bit more, just because this is the way my grandma taught me or whatever. And I get same 1/2 cup leveled off. And now I have 87 grams using the same measure, the same spoon, just a slightly different approach and technique. And then whenever I go through and, tear off one more time, I try and get it light and airy. Just going to sort of drop my flour in here. So like if I had sifted it, and then I'm going to go through and just level it off again. And now this one, 74 grams. So you can see like I've just got, a pretty significant sort of differential on what we've got going on here on each one of my cups is going to be different. Now, this is an extreme example and I intentionally tried to like highlight these differences because when you go through and do it one way, like that's your way, right? That's the way you've always done it, the way you're going to consistently do it. So you'll be a little bit more tied into it, but just to kind of highlight the sort of things to think about as you start to look at recipes, start to pull things from the internet. In America here, we tend to really like the volume measurements still. So trying to get into weight, I think is a super benefit for a lot of home cooks, and just something that I'm hoping really kind of continues to grow and evolve. So I'm doing my best to help spread it around. The other thing with weighing things, as opposed to having had, a 1/2 cup here, and let's say I had to add a cup of liquid, right? So now I would have to go through and like grab another cup. If I had taken my 1 cup measure and do it in there, then I would have, the 1 cup measure plus a 1/2 cup dirty. So now I'd have 2 things that I have to clean. And then I've still got the bowl. Now, if I was going through and had it by weight, I've got a spoon in my flour because I know that I'm going to diffy out of that. So that's just there. So I would only, at this point, still only have the 1 dirty dish I'd have to clean. And then when I add my liquid, I can go directly out of my liquid container and into this container based off of my weight. And then again, I would have one less thing I'd have to clean. So trying to think about that as well as we rock along with these kind of things. And again, my soapbox on what, using weights as opposed to volume. So for the other part of the dumpling here, we're going to go through and do a half a cup. You can do water, you can do oat milk, you can do milk. We just want to add some moisture here to this because we're going to go through and add some eggs to it, but the egg doesn't have enough moisture. It's just going to be the binding agent. I'm going to end up using oat milk. I know one thing to think about because I've done this in the past. Just making sure that you get the plain flavored of some of those alternative milks. If you choose to use them, they tend to do a lot of like vanilla or sweetened or things like that. You don't want to add like a vanilla flavor to something you're trying to make savory. So don't be aware of those kind of things. I've made that mistake more than once. Nothing's weirder than vanilla mac and cheese. I gotta tell you, just don't do it. It's a bit bizarre. So I'm at my half cup because again, I don't know the weight of this one, so this is kind of a new recipe that I'm running my way off of. But I'm gonna go through and make sure that I know what I'm shooting for here, so I get it nice and full. And so it came out to 135 grams. And so I'll make a note of it. If I imagine that my half cups were 80 grams worth of flour a piece, this would be 160 grams worth of flour against 135 grams worth of liquid. I don't tend to use a lot of recipes as like sort of gospel. I tend to use them as blueprints on things that I can go through and kind of adjust. Like they help me to remember ratios or they give me a starting point. But I tend to I'll use a recipe the first time or I'll look up a recipe for the first time. And then just with these additional notes, trying to think about okay, so what does that mean? I'm, like 2/3 dry to 1/3 liquid, plus I add my 2 eggs. Just for me, I'm trying to understand the components because that's how I pull things together differently. If you like recipes, writing in the margins a lot of cookbooks is great. Just kind of creating some sort of record for yourself. But again, I think there's a lot of benefit to transitioning out of volume measurements and into weight. All right, so now we're going to go through and we're going to add 2 eggs to this. Cracking eggs. There's a lot of things about kind of cracking it on the edge. There's one thing about, if you crack it on the edge, depending on how the egg goes, you're kind of like forcing eggshell into the egg. So I was always taught to kind of do it on a flat surface because I get my divot and then it starts to create my cracks here, but I don't have to worry about any egg pieces being in it. And now I can just use my fingers to sort of pull apart that membrane and then just let that drop without having a whole lot of extra fragments kind of floating around. It takes a little bit of practice. Sometimes it's not going to come off or be nice and easy on the first egg. I have had these eggs out room temperature for the last hour. Pardon me. I had these eggs out room temperature, so they are going to crack a little easier, just because I knew that I was going to go through and do this. I've known that eggs out of the refrigerator, directly out of the refrigerator, tend to be a little bit tougher. So things to think about. Eggs tend to be about 50 grams a piece. Your regular large eggs. So for this, it came out to about 100 grams worth of egg into this batter, in case you're rocking those notes along at home. All right, and so for this now, I know that I've got a lot of flour. I've got my liquid, I've got my eggs. This is basically going to be a whole lot of flavor, sort of like a flavor absorber. If we're not careful with it. So we want to go through and I want to season this. So I'm going to take my salt and pepper mix that I have, but you can do salt and then pepper however you want. But I want to be a little aggressive with it. I want to put more salt and pepper into these right now than I have currently put into my soup, knowing that the flour is going to dampen how much that flavor comes through whenever we eat it. But I don't want these to just be big lumps of flavorless nothing kind of floating into the soup. So we have to give it a little bit more of a punch right away. Now I'm going to grab a fork. I'm going to hunt up my egg yolks, kind of make sure that those break, almost kind of like a scrambling motion of the liquid. And then slowly kind of going a little bit deeper into it to grab the flour elements, kind of continuing that sort of scrambling round motion. Kind of diving the fork into the corners of my bowl because I know that my bowl has a good solid edge to it. I'm gonna start rotating it around and just slowly kind of bringing in more of that flour into my wet mixture. Yeah, swooping back with the area I've already been through. But I still have a nice pocket over here of dry stuff I haven't gotten to yet. So I'm just kind of continuing to work this through. If I need to kind of change my grip, right now I was kind of doing a thumb finger sort of wrist flick. If I get a little tired, I can kind of get a little bit more of a an aggressive grip on it, so that way I'm moving more my whole arm. If you need to adjust just because it's starting to wear you out, do what you got to do. But we're just slowly kind of adding in the flour to this dough so we can keep an eyeball on it. So now you can see it's getting super thick. I still have some dry spots. Now I'm just gonna go through and do a full sweep around that outside edge. I'm trying not to be too aggressive with it because I don't want these to get really, it's the British baking term for it, stodgy. I don't want them to get super stodgy or sort of tough. Because what happens is once you add moisture to flour, it starts to develop gluten. And gluten is really great stuff in bread that goes through and gives it structure so that way it can hold those air pockets and kind of create lift. It's great in pasta because it provides bounce. There's a lot of places where gluten's really great. There's some other places where it's a little less desirable. So we want to try and keep it to a minimum. So once I've kind of got all that flour done, that's it. We're going to leave that bad boy as it is. And that's going to be our dumpling mix. Now, what we can do, take this, put it over there. Now I can think of two solid ways to go through and kind of like add this to the mix of our soup. One is a little bit more of a painstaking, what I would refer to as French style. Apologies for jostling the camera. Hopefully nobody's getting any motion sickness. All right, so I'm gonna grab 2 spoons and you kind of scoop one, or use one to scoop, right, to get the size that you want, imagining that they're gonna expand a little bit when they cook. So, sort of trying to keep it, bite size on the spoon. You wanna go a little bit smaller. If you wanna go, big monster, like matzo ball style soup balls, you can go through and do that as well, but be aware that it's going to take them longer to go through and cook. So something that you want to try and like coordinate into what you're trying to do. You can adjust accordingly either direction. So with this, you can kind of do, they refer to as like a drop method, where now I've got it on the spoon here and I'm just going to take it off this other one and then just scoop it and then it drops right off into there. Sometimes, you can get into a pretty good sort of rhythm of it. There's a fancier French style where you make quenelles, which is basically like a 3-sided sort of oblong where you take 2 spoons and you sort of do this like scoop it out of the bowl thing. But then once you kind of, get it to where you want it, you just sort of cut and do a drop style from the side. So you can get pretty fast with some practice. If you want to go through and do your soup that way. If you are, I guess there's a couple ways. There's if you're fancy and have all the gadgets, and you have like a little ice cream scooper, probably like a number 80 or 100, like a little small boy, you can just go through and scoop it and plop it, scoop it and plop it, scoop it and plop it. I have a couple of those around for cookies. I don't think I have one small enough for what I want to do for this, but depending on could you make this often enough. And then last one would be doing the sort of pastry bag or faux pastry bag kind of method. And with that, what we would do is we would have a Ziploc bag. If you don't have a pastry bag, or you don't know what a pastry bag is, basically pastry bag is going to be a big sort of cone that is a bag. So open on one end, and then you sort of cut the tip on the other end, so that way you can use it to like pipe things. They do it with cakes. If you've ever seen anybody do like pastry competitions and things like that, and they're doing it with icing, that's in a piping bag. But if you don't have piping bags or disposable piping bags, you don't want to get them, and you have Ziplocs, you can do basically the same thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to take and open one end, while the bag is all still 100% intact. And take our dumpling filling and we're going to scoop it into the bag. A couple of things you can do with this if you have extra cups or things that you can go through and kind of parse it into. If you have, like a drinking cup or extra like to-go containers, you can kind of use your bag and rim it, so that way it gives it a little bit more stability for you to go through and fill the bag, so you're less likely to make a mess. I tend to just sort of muscle it through with the table, but of course I also make a mess more often than not, so probably a good practice to be a little more, to make a little mess, a little less. Okay. Sort of pinch off that piece on the inside there. Okay, now we're gonna take it, I'm gonna sort of shimmy it out of the cup. Okay, now I'm gonna take and refold out my lip here. I'm gonna give it a nice good seal. We can push out a little bit of that extra air. Get a good seal on there. Now, what I wanna do is I'm gonna basically cut a corner of this off and then use it as my sort of tip to go through and squeeze stuff out with. So I'm gonna push it back from the edge. Start small because you can always go bigger. You can't put any back on again. Make sure you don't lose that piece of plastic that needs to go in the trash and not in the food. And then now what I can do is I can take and I'll take my tip here. I'm gonna kind of wad it up in my hand. And then as I squeeze my hand, you can see that that filling starts to go right up to the tip. So our soup is simmering nicely. We're about to throw in our dumpling filling. I'm gonna go ahead and add my green beans, because these are all gonna kind of cook around the same time. Once I get my dumplings in, I'm gonna go through and I'm gonna put a lid on this and let it sort of simmer closed. That's gonna increase the heat a little bit while not increasing too much action on here, because I don't want it to be so aggressive on the boil that it's gonna cause my dumplings to explode or disintegrate. So we still want that nice gentle simmer, but I want to trap in some of that heat. So I've got my lid already ready to go. I've added my green beans. I'm actually going to turn my temperature up just a little bit. Because as you can see, as soon as I added my green beans, I kind of, like the temperature was right on the cusp. And so now it's kind of gone into flat. And so as I add these dumplings, I don't want to drop the temperature of the soup too much because I want them to start cooking right away. So we're going to give that a quick second, drink a little beer. Even better when it warms up. Okay. So what we're gonna do is I still have my spoon from tasting. I'm gonna have that in one hand. I'm on my pastry bag in the other hand for my dumplings. And I'm gonna go through and over the soup, I'm going to start to squeeze out my filling in a way that I can see it pretty good. And then I'm gonna take my spoon and when I get it to the right size that I want, I'm just gonna take my spoon and go down and let that drop right into the broth. And I'm gonna squeeze another one and then cut it with my spoon. And another one, cut it with a spoon. Trying to keep them as close to the same size as I can. I'm also kind of moving around the pot a little bit. So I'm trying to make sure that they've got a little bit of time to cook before they get hit with another little blob of raw dough. Oop, I'll hang around there. Oop. Okay. Now I've got probably, I don't know, 7, 8 of these bad boys in here. So I'm gonna take a pause, take my my spatula here and just give it a little gentle run around, right? Like I don't wanna cause these things to start to explode, but I wanna make sure that they get fully submersed. Just sort of gently playing with the vegetables that are in there. Get everything kind of going so that way I don't see them. I'm ready to come back to it. And then Squeeze it out. How does it look over there? You see it pretty well? Okay. So we're just squeezing it out and then just getting that cut there. If I've got a little spot where the soup is bubbling, like that's a perfect sort of landing zone, right? Because that heat right off the bat is going to start working on that flour and the egg and helping these dumplings get set up so they're less likely to disintegrate before they get a chance to get cooked all the way through. And if at some point you're like, you know what, I got 20, 30 dumplings in here, it's more than enough, then you can, by all means, you know, stop whenever you feel like you're good. Don't feel like you're committed to having to use all the batter. I don't really think I don't know if you would be able to freeze it and stash it for another day. You probably would, but it might be a little loose, just because, again, what freezing food does to it. But it's not outside of the realm. But now I got another sort of 10 in here. I'm gonna go through, give them a little stir, and now I can start to see some of those first rounders popping back up to the top, looking good. They're not looking like they've exploded. I actually have some definition against the way that they are. When I'm moving the stuff around in the pot, I also want to make sure that I'm just kind of gently sort of searching the bottom and making sure that there's nobody stuck there, as I'm just kind of gently trying to move everything around here to create some space for these dumplings to cook through. Now with the dumplings, you got a little bit more flexibility as far as like flavoring stuff goes. So if you wanted to, I mean, depending on the type of soup, what you're feeling, you can throw some fresh herbs into the dumpling mix, you know, to give them a little bit more pop and bounce. You can put in some, you know, cheese as well, if that fits with the flavor of your soup. You know, they will add a little bit of, you know, saltiness to it. So just be careful about that with your seasoning. But it's a great place to kind of like really take this sort of base concept and really make it your own and adjust it to how you want and what you're feeling for that day when you're making the soup. I think I might be about there. I see a lot of dumplings when I'm rocking through. Hopefully you can see them as well. Like kind of, they're just a little bit bigger than all the rest of my pieces. But I don't think that that's really going to be a make or break moment for me. I think that that's still going to be great. They are, you know, just, you know, like if I get one on my spoon, it is the whole spoon. But again, I think it's not going to be too far out of whack because I want that nice sort of bite and that bounce to it. And as I, you know, kind of go back to like having it be spoon size, you can see even with a little baby teaspoon, you know, like I can get, you know, a decent amount of vegetables kind of like all spread out throughout there. But the dumpling is definitely the highlight, you know, sort of the center of the plate, as it were, if we're talking about sort of another type of dish. I think I got plenty of dumplings in there for what I want. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and chop off my top, set this up on the side, and then we're going to let that rock for about 15 minutes. Set a timer if you like. Tell your Amazon doodad or your Google doodad to sing you a 15-minute song or whatever it is. I think Inagata Davida is right about that right time frame. So by the time you're all done with that, you should be good. At the end of the first drum solo, something. So now we can go through and kind of clean up while we're waiting for that to rock along. Now is an opportunity to go through and, you know, if you have some fresh herbs or something else that you want to garnish with, depending on the soup that you made. I've got a little bit of chives that we have left over from something else. So I'm going to go through and chop up these chives and set them aside, you know, just so that way I can sprinkle a little bit on top and get a little bit of freshness to it. About halfway through this simmer here, I'm going to crack it back open and we're going to try it for flavor. And again, if I need to season it a little bit more, now will be the time, just because we've added all that flour in there and I want to see how much of the flavor of the broth has been impacted by having that sort of flavor absorber, you know, dropped into it and rocking its way along. So I don't know, anybody got anything else? Having a good time so far? Any suggestions, adjustments? How's your soup tasting? How's it looking? feel free to unmute yourself if you're comfortable with it.
What are you drinking?
There you go, like the social distance boys. What are you drinking? What's in your glass today?
Stefan, my soup is delicious, and I put
That's
egg
nice.
noodles in it.
Wow, that's a good choice.
How long do we want this to simmer before we eat it?
Wait, say that one more time. I'm sorry.
How long do we want this to simmer before we eat it?
Well, so if you got dumplings in there, probably about that 15-minute mark, just to make sure that they cooked all the way through. We're trying to get that center piece up to about 145 degrees, just to make sure that we kind of, actually, pardon me, 165 degrees, in order to make sure that we cook out any potential damage from the, or danger from the egg.
Eggs.
Yeah, so just to kind of be on the safe side, if you go a little smaller with the dumplings, you can go through and do it a little less. Something about soup is that overall, you know, it tends to be a little bit better the next day, or if it's had a time to like sort of been made and then cooled down and then heated again. I talked about flavor babies briefly earlier, and so it's one of those things that you know, as we go through and introduce, you know, carrots, onions, celery all together with oil and heat, right? Like you know, we talked about the conversation in the parties. Once we add liquid to it, we've kind of created a perfect sort of next step, first date kind of thing. And we're giving these guys an opportunity to sort of mingle and meld and create something new and fantastic. You know, like you can take raw onion and celery and carrot and eat it all at once, but it's going to be a completely different flavor profile than what we've got going on here, because we've evolved and changed the process and kind of added in this next layer of, you know, sort of I guess evolution, or you know, like food genetics, to be able to go through and kind of create this piece along. So there's something to be said for making the soup, you know, the day before, if you know that you're going to have people over, or, you know, saving some soup for the next day, just because it is going to be a very, you know, most times it'll be an incredibly more robust and developed sort of element of flavor to it. Yep, and then some soups you can definitely freeze, and then have them for down the road. My soup's going a little aggressive. I think I'm good because the dumplings seem like they're well formed. They're not really kind of breaking apart, but it is a little higher and hotter than I wanted. I heard the steam kind of seeping from the lid. So I turned it down a little bit here. But you can see they're all kind of floating up toward the top. They look good, beautiful, nice and big. I'm gonna go ahead and get that taste on the seasoning and see how they go. Put the lid back on, so that way those little dumplings keep cooking along.
I'm gonna walk over here so Holly can hear me. Holly, I want to hear about your soda with chocolate bitters.
Ooh.
Is that just soda water, or?
Tasty, tasty.
So I'm doing a cocktail project this month on Instagram, and I had to buy mixers. So I picked up chocolate Aztec bitters, and before I tried them in a cocktail, I wanted to try them kind of on their own. So soda, ice, and a few dashes of bitters. And they're delicious.
So about how much soda are we talking about? Like 4 ounces?
Yeah, 4 to 6.
Okay.
I just used whatever I had left over from the can that I used from last night's cocktail, which was gin and pomegranate with lime and simple syrup, and I topped it up with soda. So I just had a little bit of soda left.
Nice. Yeah, we've been playing the cocktail game a little bit here and there. I don't have a whole lot of like crazy bitters. I think the best one was probably the Masmole from AZ Sun Bitters. Bitters Lab, AZ Bitters Lab. But I didn't try it in like straight soda. I've just been adding it to things like it. I added to my old fashioned, and definitely fun to kind of like play around like just that one piece of that drink and how it'll really impact it across the board. Fun stuff. All right, dumplings are cracking along. I added a little bit of black pepper to it, just because I think I needed a little bit more of that. I think salt was probably pretty on the money for where we stand. I got about 8 minutes left to go on this, but I mean, at this stage in the game, the last thing to do is really just to, sort of add some fresh herbs to it, and then it's, time to eat. So I don't know if we really need to like sit here for the next 8 minutes and just sort of like watch soup boil, but I did see, what was that? Nice. I got you. Coffee with Jameson cold brew it. That's good. Dig it. Gotcha. Aaron's over here in the background trying to get ready to make stout floats. So you get that espresso Yeti, and then we had some salted caramel, sea salt caramel gelato. So I think we're about to get a little wild float action here. Ooh, should be good. Oh yeah, look at those babies.
Any other questions, or do we want to make some things another time?
Yeah, no, I think thank you all for get the right camera. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Hopefully it was useful and helpful and kind of informative. I don't know what we would want to do for the next round or when or if there's a next round, but we can take some suggestions, thoughts about it now, or add it to that Facebook page. Yeah, post in that event. We can kind of talk about it. I've tried really hard not to like do the magic of TV with it. I really wanted to try and just make sure it was real time, but if we needed to adjust the format or if we make it a little bit faster, but just figured sort of a chill thing we would do in the afternoon and kind of go from there. So let me know what you think. And again, thank you so much. Hopefully you have a great rest of your Sunday. The recording, yeah. So I'm gonna go through, and this will be my first time having recorded something like this. So I got to get it transferred and adjusted. But if I get it into a chunk where I can post it up on YouTube, I'll drop the link in the group as well, so we can run back through it for posterity's sake. Yeah, in the event. Oh, Costco dumplings. Yeah, no, that'd be good too. Yeah, and one of the things I think, I talk about these days a lot more with cooking, like there's a lot to be said for doing things 100% from scratch, but it's a lot of work, and sometimes you need something that's not going to take, where we at 2 hours to be able to go through and like make a meal. And some of those things, like they make really great products out there, if you know what it is, what you're trying to do with it and you like it, like, get after it. I think we did a dessert last night where we took store-bought angel food cake and I just sliced it thin and then toasted it under the oven in the broiler, and it just made something that was really super basic and like would have been too sticky sweet on its own, and like adjusted it into something that was better than the sum of its parts. And it took all of 3 minutes, and like there was next to no cleanup on it. And so like there's a lot of those convenience things out there that really kind of help level something off. Absolutely. Yeah, you can totally add more protein to this. If you're a meat eater, you can go through and float chicken in it. You can get pre-cooked chicken, like those rotisserie chickens are, a good, easy way to add like pre-cooked protein to it. You can cook it from raw. You just want to make sure that you add it in. I'd probably add any like beef or chicken at the like sauteing the vegetable stage, that beginning part with the mirepoix, just to make sure that you cook it all the way through. But if you're adding tofu, you can probably wait until like right before we do the dumplings, because we just want to kind of heat it through and give it a chance to sort of absorb those flavors without getting too crazy.
Thank you, Stefan.
No
Appreciate.
problem.
See you
Absolutely.
next-
All right. Take care. Beer float.
I know Ivana said she wanted to do some seafood.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Alana.
Thank you guys. It was greatly appreciated. Had a good time. Nice to see you guys.
Thank you. Good to see you. Bye.
Bye.
You're podcasting now? Why do we have the fancy
Nancy Mike. I think Sherry might have already bounced.
phone messenger?
My coworker has one as well. All right, let's see here. Looks like it's still Cammie and Taylor. But otherwise, I think we're all good. Ladies, was there anything else before we go through and shut it down?
Thank you. That was
No
very
problem. Thank you.
enjoyable.
Right on.
Now I'm hungry though.
Yeah, hard to just watch food TV and not really eat anything at some point.
Exactly.
If you didn't cook, come to the driveway and we'll give you a bowl.
There you go. Yeah, we have plenty of soup. So if you didn't cook it, if you want to swing by the driveway real fast here, we'll be able to pack you up a bowl of it.
Good to know. Except you have
We'll have
mushrooms.
another beer for you.
Yeah, I do have mushrooms in it. Sorry, it is the way it goes.
You can work around them.
All right, guys. So I'm gonna shut this down. Thank you again. I appreciate it. And we'll go through and figure out the link and the rest of it, throw it in the group, and we'll start figuring out the next time.
Awesome.
All righty. Have fun.
Thanks.